You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In 1800, the Acts of Union merged the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This move eliminated the Irish Parliament and granted Ireland a voice in the British Parliament. However, this arrangement immediately became problematic. Many Irish people, identifying as nationalists, were against the Union, unhappy with their lack of a significant political voice, the British government's management of Irish affairs, and especially their handling of catastrophic events like the Great Famine. Shortly before this union, there was an Irish uprising which, along with its centenary, would inspire the Easter Rising. Despite 3 additional uprisings in 1803, 1848, and 1867, all efforts to break away failed. The fight against the Union also took more peaceful forms, including legal and social avenues such as the Repeal Association, the Home Rule League, the push for the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, and the Land League's activism. The Irish Home Rule movement, aiming for self-governance within the UK, saw its first significant parliamentary attempt under Charles Stewart Parnell with the first Home Rule Bill in 1886, but it did not pass. The second Home Rule Bill got through the House of Commons in 1893, but was shot down by the House of Lords. After Parnell's death, frustration with parliamentary politics led to a rise in more radical nationalist movements. This period saw the birth of the Gaelic Athletic Association, the Gaelic League, and a cultural revival led by figures like W.B. Yeats and Augusta, Lady Gregory. Arthur Griffith's writings in his newspaper Sinn Féin and other organisations sparked a new wave of Irish identity focused on an independent Ireland. In 1912, the third Home Rule Bill proposed by British Prime Minister H.H. Asquith faced stiff opposition from Irish Unionists, mainly Protestants, who feared being governed by a Catholic majority. Edward Carson and James Craig led this resistance, forming the Ulster Volunteers in 1913, ready to fight if necessary. In response, the Irish Volunteers was created in November 1913 to support Home Rule, with a prominent role played by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, reignited in 1909, and fearing complacency with British rule. The Irish Citizen Army also emerged from the Dublin lockout, prepared for more militant action. Though the third Home Rule Bill was technically passed, the outbreak of the First World War postponed its implementation. The expectation was that the war would be brief. However, the Irish Volunteers split. The majority, named the National Volunteers, joined the British Army, while a separatist minority saw England's wartime struggles as an opportunity for Irish independence. They aimed to abolish British governance from Dublin Castle and establish a national government for Ireland. Just over a month after Britain entered World War I, on September 5, 1914, the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB, made a pivotal decision. They resolved to organise an uprising against British rule in Ireland before the war concluded, aiming to enlist Germany's support for their cause. Key figures such as Tom Clarke and Sean MacDiarmada were entrusted with the uprising's planning, while Patrick Pearse, Michael Joseph O'Rahilly, Joseph Plunkett and Bulmer Hobson took on leadership roles in the Volunteers by March 1915. By May of the same year, Clarke and MacDiarmada further solidified their plans by forming a military council within the IRB, including Pearse, Plunkett and Eamon Seant, along with themselves, to map out the revolt. This council operated secretly and against the views of those who thought an uprising was ill-timed. Notably, Ian McNeill, the Volunteer Chief of Staff, endorsed an uprising only under specific conditions, such as a British move to suppress the Volunteers or the introduction of conscription in Ireland, and only with a feasible chance of success. The Council's plans were kept under wraps to prevent British intelligence from catching wind of them and to counteract internal opposition. Even Dennis McCulloch, the IRB president, was not fully in the loop, and figures like McNeill were only briefed as the uprising drew near. Despite most volunteers being unaware of the specific plans, their training intensified, leading to increased scrutiny from authorities and rumours of a looming uprising. Though civil servants were generally discouraged from joining, volunteer ranks swelled, growing from 9,700 to 12,215 members between December 1914 and February 1916. Simultaneously, Roger Casement and John Devoy engaged with the German government, advocating for Irish independence and seeking military assistance. Although their ambitious plans for an Irish brigade and a German military expedition did not materialise, Germany agreed to supply arms and ammunition to the volunteers. In parallel, James Connolly, leader of the Irish Citizen Army, threatened to initiate his own rebellion unless other groups took action. In January 1916, IRB leaders managed to incorporate Connolly into their plans, aligning for a united uprising planned for Easter. Connolly became the 6th member of the military council, with Thomas MacDonagh joining later as the 7th. The death of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosser in August 1915 provided a powerful moment for mobilization. His body was brought back to Ireland for burial, with the volunteers organizing a significant funeral procession. Pearse's oration at the graveside became a memorable call to action, famously ending with the declaration that Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. In early April, Pearse informed the Irish volunteers to prepare for 3 days of parades and manoeuvres starting on Easter Sunday, intended as a guise for the planned uprising. As the director of organization, Pearse had the authority to issue such commands, and those in the know perceived this as a signal for action, while others, including MacNeill and the British authorities, regarded it merely as routine activities. On April 9th, the German Navy dispatched the SS Libau, camouflaged as the Ard, to County Kerry, laden with a substantial cache of arms and explosives for the uprising. Meanwhile, Casement made his way to Ireland on a German submarine, disheartened by the Germans' limited support and aiming to postpone or cancel the uprising. Concurrently, the volunteers were amassing their own stockpile of weapons with the assistance of young Michael McCabe, among others. On April 19th, Alderman Tom Kelly, a member of Sinn Féin, unveiled a so-called castle document at a city gathering, alleging the British were plotting arrests and takeovers. Despite British officials declaring the document a forgery, it persuaded MacNeill and others to ready themselves for resistance. Nonetheless, this document was actually a ploy by the uprising's orchestrators, crafted from a real document but modified to gain support. That very night, the leaders of the volunteers disclosed the actual plan to initiate the rebellion on Easter Sunday to selected officers, excluding the general membership and moderates like MacNeill until the last moment. Upon hearing whispers about the forthcoming uprising, MacNeill tried to thwart it, confronting Pearse but refraining from alerting the British. Pearse's commands were upheld, while MacNeill and others who objected to the hasty approach were left uninformed. The German cargoes arrived early on April 21st, with neither Allies nor the volunteers positioned to retrieve them. The British Navy intercepted the SS Libau, resulting in its destruction by the captain, and Casement was apprehended shortly after arriving at Bannostrand. The discovery of the scuttled arms shipment led MacNeill to publicly call off all scheduled volunteer activities for Sunday, eliciting a day's delay and disarray within the ranks. British intelligence was previously aware of the German arms, Casement, and the targeted date for the uprising, thanks to intercepted communications. This insight was somewhat corroborated by John Dillon's warning to Redmond before the rising about unsettling whispers in Dublin. In spite of being forewarned, British officials in Ireland wavered. The capture of the SS Libau and Casement's detention prompted them to consider action. Initial strategies involved targeted raids, but a decision for broader arrests was postponed until after Easter Monday, pending approval from higher authorities in London. By the time they decided to act, on April 24th, the rising had already begun. Following MacNeill's cancellation, the military council postponed the start date to Easter Monday, resolving to go ahead with the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizen Army as the newly proclaimed Army of the Irish Republic, designating Pearse as its president and commander-in-chief, and Connolly as the leader of the Dublin Brigade. Preparations intensified over the weekend, with the completed plans relayed to all units involved. On the morning of Monday, April 24th, around 1,200 members of groups called the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army gathered in central Dublin. This group also included women from the Cumann na Mban. Some were dressed in military uniforms, while others wore their everyday clothes, but marked themselves with a distinctive yellow armband. They were armed with a variety of weapons, ranging from rifles and shotguns to semi-automatic pistols and grenades. However, the turnout was lower than anticipated, due to a last-minute change in plans by one of their leaders, MacNeill. Despite this, as the events unfolded, more volunteers joined the effort. Just before noon, these rebels began taking control of key spots throughout central Dublin, aiming to hold the city centre. This area was strategically chosen, bordered by 2 canals and the River Liffey, providing an advantage by being hard for British forces to penetrate due to the proximity of British Army barracks. They quickly evacuated civilians, took control of important buildings, and set up defences. A notable group, led by James Connolly, and including several key leaders, took over the General Post Office on O'Connell Street, raising 2 flags, signalling their claim. Patrick Pearse, one of the leaders, publicly read the proclamation of the Irish Republic outside the General Post Office, marking a formal declaration of rebellion. They even achieved a historic moment by making Ireland's first radio broadcast, announcing the establishment of an Irish Republic. Several other groups occupied strategic locations around Dublin, setting up defences and preparing for British retaliation. In an attempt to disrupt British mobility and communication, the rebels took over bridges, railway stations, and cut wires. An early attempt to signal the uprising's start by blowing up ammunition at the magazine fort was less successful than hoped, but clarified that the uprising had begun. At Dublin City Hall, another group made an attempt on Dublin Castle, a symbol of British rule, but faced strong resistance and were ultimately unable to seize it. Early confrontations led to the first casualties on both sides, with both the rebels and British forces caught off guard by the day's events. Despite their efforts, the rebels faced challenges due to insufficient manpower and did not manage to secure all their targeted locations. Miscommunications also led to unfortunate incidents where civilians were harmed. The British military, initially taken by surprise, swiftly began coordinating a response. The first day of the rising was marked by a mix of strategic successes and setbacks for the rebels, setting the stage for further conflict in the days to come. As a sign of the chaos, looting broke out in the city centre, adding to the turmoil of what was to become a significant chapter in Irish history. On a Tuesday evening, Lord Wimborne, the Lord Lieutenant, announced martial law and handed over the reins of civil power to Brigadier General William Lowe. With the situation tense, British forces focused on securing the surroundings of Dublin Castle and tried to cut off the rebels, who they believed were entrenched in Liberty Hall. General Lowe, cautious due to uncertainty about the size of the rebel forces, had around 1,269 troops at his disposal when he arrived in Dublin from Courage Camp early on Tuesday, the 25th of April. The British managed to retake City Hall from the rebels, who had attacked Dublin Castle that Tuesday morning. Before the break of dawn on that same Tuesday, 120 British soldiers armed with machine guns took strong positions in the Shelbourne Hotel and United Services Club, overlooking St. Stephen's Green. With the arrival of dawn, they began shooting at the citizen army in the park. The rebels returned fire, but eventually had to retreat to the Royal College of Surgeons, where they remained for the week, exchanging fire with British forces. That Tuesday afternoon saw confrontations on the city's northern fringes. In the northeast, British troops arriving from Amiens Street railway station in an armoured train aimed to repair a damaged section of the track, but were ambushed by rebels at Annesley Bridge, leading to a British retreat after 2 hours of fighting. Meanwhile, in Phibsborough to the northwest, rebels had taken strategic positions and set up barricades, prompting the British to call in artillery from Athlone, resulting in intense battles. That same afternoon, Pearse boldly stepped out on O'Connell Street, reading a manifesto to the citizens of Dublin in front of a large crowd, urging them to support the rising. Despite their efforts, the rebels could not take control of Dublin's major railway stations or its ports, allowing the British to significantly reinforce their troops over the following week. By the week's end, British forces numbered over 16,000, bolstered by artillery and the patrol vessel Helga, which played key roles in attacks on rebel positions. Some rebel leaders, like James Connolly, doubted the British would resort to shelling what was considered the second city of the British Empire. In the broader context, major rebel strongholds faced less direct combat, adopting more a strategy of encirclement and bombardment by the British, leading to standstills with moments of levity among the rebels despite occasional exchanges of fire. In a lesser-known incident on Tuesday evening, a group of volunteers, led by Eamon Martin, attempted to take over Broadstone railway station but failed, resulting in Martin sustaining injuries. The next morning, British forces surrounded the Mendicity Institution, defended by 26 volunteers under Sean Houston's command, leading to a drawn-out standoff ending in the rebels' surrender after a valiant 3-day resistance. On Wednesday, British reinforcements arriving at Kingstown encountered severe resistance at the Grand Canal from a small contingent of volunteers, demonstrating the rebels' strategic impact despite being greatly outnumbered. Meanwhile, in a separate move to prevent British reoccupation, Linnenhall barracks were deliberately set ablaze under Commandant Edward Daly's orders. During the Easter Rising, 2 key locations in Dublin saw significant combat and heavy losses for the British forces: the South Dublin Union, which is today's location of St. James's Hospital, and Marrowbone Lane. The South Dublin Union was a sprawling complex where intense battles unfolded both outside and within its structures. Among the rebels, Cathal Brugha stood out for his bravery, despite being severely injured. By the week's end, while the British had captured portions of the Union, rebels still held other areas. Similarly, the British faced tough resistance and suffered casualties during direct attacks on Marrowbone Lane Distillery. Another fierce battleground was North King Street, situated to the north of the Four Courts. The rebels, having taken control of various small buildings and set up barricades, fiercely defended their position from Thursday to Saturday. British forces faced significant resistance, suffering losses during attempts to overtake the area, including a notable failed bayonet charge led by Major Shepherd. To combat the rebel fire, the British used machine guns and creatively navigated the battlefield by moving through the internal walls of houses and utilizing armored trucks. Despite these efforts, by the time of the rebel surrender on Saturday, the South Staffordshire Regiment had only moved 150 yards down North King Street, at the cost of 11 soldiers killed and 28 wounded. Angered, some British troops retaliated by forcefully entering homes along the street, killing or injuring 15 unarmed men they accused of being involved with the rebels. Separately, at Portobello Barracks, a notably grim event occurred when Officer Bowen Colthurst executed 6 civilians without trial, among them the pacifist nationalist Francis Sheehy Skeffington. These actions, where British troops killed Irish civilians, sparked significant controversy and outrage in Ireland. After enduring several days of intense shelling, the group stationed at the General Post Office headquarters had no choice but to leave because the building caught fire from the bombardments. By this time, Connolly couldn't lead because he had been seriously wounded by a bullet in his ankle, leaving Pearse in charge. In a daring move, the O'Rahilly was killed while trying to break free from the General Post Office. To escape without facing gunfire, they cleverly moved through the walls into nearby buildings, eventually setting up in 16 Moore Street. Here, the young Sean McLaughlin was ready to lead a breakout, but Pearse, wanting to avoid more civilian casualties, decided against it. Among those who left last with Pearse and Connolly were 3 brave women from Cumann na Mban, Connolly's right-hand woman, Winifred Carney, who had been part of the initial group, along with Elizabeth O'Farrell and Julia Grennan, who served as messengers and nurses. On Saturday, the 29th of April, speaking from their new position, Pearse called for all their forces to lay down their arms. He surrendered without any conditions to Brigadier General Lowe. Pearse explained the surrender in a document saying, "In order to prevent the further slaughter of Dublin citizens, and in the hope of saving the lives of our followers now surrounded and hopelessly outnumbered, the members of the provisional government present at headquarters have agreed to an unconditional surrender, and the commandants of the various districts in the city and county will order their commands to lay down arms." The rest of their positions only gave up after O'Farrell delivered Pearse's instructions to surrender, so some fighting went on until Sunday, when finally all rebel groups received the message to surrender. Command of the British forces was then handed over to General John Maxwell, who had just arrived in Dublin. Maxwell took over as the temporary military governor of Ireland, marking the end of the rebellion. The plan was to spark a nationwide rebellion, but a mix-up and the failure to obtain German weapons really threw a wrench in the works. Charles Townshend thinks the whole idea of a countrywide uprising didn't have much support to begin with, as everything seemed to focus on Dublin. However, this idea is being debated more nowadays. Down in Cork, about 1,200 volunteers rallied under Thomas McCurtain. They remained until Wednesday, when after receiving a bunch of conflicting orders, they decided to call it quits. There was a tense moment with British forces at their Cork headquarters. Under pressure, and to the dismay of many in his ranks, McCurtain ended up surrendering their weapons to the British. The significant conflict in County Cork happened when the police tried to storm the Kent family's residence. The Kents resisted, leading to a 3-hour shootout that resulted in the death of a police officer, and one of the Kents, with another Kent later being executed. After the uprising, authorities thoroughly searched every rebel's home. Up in the north, volunteers gathered in County Tyrone and Donegal, but due to all the confusion, they didn't engage in the fight. Moving over to North County Dublin, about 60 volunteers from the 5th Battalion of the Dublin Brigade, led by Thomas Ashe, demonstrated effective guerrilla tactics. They acquired weapons from the Royal Irish Constabulary Barracks and disrupted railway lines and telegraphs. Their significant moment occurred in Ashbourne, County Meath, where they forced a large group of police to surrender after intense fighting. Ashe's group showcased a glimpse of future warfare tactics during the Irish War of Independence. Other groups attempted to join them but arrived too late. Down in County Wexford, in the town of Enniscorthy, around 100 to 200 volunteers took control and even staged a show of force, echoing a historic 1798 rebellion site. The local support was strong. British forces eventually showed up with a significant display of power, and it was only when the rebel leaders were shown proof of the surrender order that they agreed to surrender. In County Galway, Liam Mellows and his 600 to 700 volunteers, despite being underarmed, attempted to divert British attention from Dublin with limited success. British naval forces had to intervene to suppress their efforts, and by Saturday, the rebels dispersed, with many being captured. Lastly, in Limerick and Clare, volunteers assembled but ultimately did not take action, either because they were waiting on orders or weapons that never arrived. The Glasnevin Trust reports that the Easter Rising led to at least 485 people losing their lives. Breaking down those numbers, about 54% or 260 people were civilians. Approximately 26% or 126 were part of the UK forces. Around 16% or 82 were Irish rebels, and about 4% or 17 were police officers. In addition to those killed, over 2,600 individuals were injured, which includes at least 2,200 civilians and rebels, at least 370 British soldiers and 29 policemen. Notably, all 16 police officers and 22 of the British soldiers who died were from Ireland. Tragically, about 40 children under the age of 17 were also killed, with 4 being members of the rebel forces. The deadly toll increased each day, starting with 55 deaths on Monday and peaking at 78 on Saturday. The British Army faced their heaviest losses at the Battle of Mount Street Bridge on Wednesday, losing at least 30 soldiers, which was also a significant day of loss for the rebels. The Royal Irish Constabulary suffered greatly during the Battle of Ashbourne on Friday. Most of those killed or wounded were civilians, with the British Army responsible for a significant portion of these casualties. This was largely due to their use of heavy weapons in populated areas and a failure to distinguish rebels from non-combatants. One officer from the Royal Irish Regiment described the situation, saying they saw everyone as an enemy and shot at any movement. There were also instances where civilians were purposefully shot by both the British and the rebels for various reasons, including not following orders or getting caught looting. Additionally, there were acts of revenge or frustration by British troops, notably the North King Street massacre, where 15 civilians were killed, and at Portobello Barracks, where 6 were shot. Even cases of friendly fire occurred, such as when the Royal Dublin Fusiliers accidentally killed 2 British officers and 2 Irish civilians, mistakenly believing them to be rebels. Historians like Feargal McGarry highlight that the rebels generally aimed to minimize unnecessary bloodshed. Desmond Ryan noted that volunteers were instructed to only fire when ordered or when repelling an attack. Apart from the confrontation at Ashbourne, there wasn't a systematic targeting of policemen or unarmed soldiers, and a group of policemen was even allowed to stand by Nelson's pillar throughout the first day. McGarry remarked that the Irish citizen army was more likely than the volunteers to target policemen, a stance influenced by the bitter memories of the Dublin lockout. After the uprising, most of the Irish casualties were buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. In May 1916, British families arrived at Dublin Castle to collect the bodies of soldiers, who were then given funerals. Those soldiers whose bodies were unclaimed were honoured with military funerals at Grangegorman Military Cemetery. Right after it happened, the uprising was often called the Sinn Féin Rebellion, because many people mistakenly thought Sinn Féin, which actually wasn't a militant or Republican group at the time, was responsible. General Maxwell made it clear he planned to detain all the dangerous members of Sinn Féin, even those who hadn't taken part in the latest uprising. As a result, around 3,430 men and 79 women were arrested, which included about 425 for looting. Out of these, 1,500 were actual rebels. Most of those arrested were young, Catholic, and deeply religious. After a few weeks, 1,424 men and 73 women were let go. Those detained in England and Wales without a trial were released by Christmas Eve 1916. The rest were held until June 1917. Starting May 2nd, a series of court trials began for 187 individuals. Maxwell controversially ruled these trials would be private and without any defense for the accused, a decision that was later deemed illegal. Furthermore, some trial officials had a direct conflict of interest as they had commanded British forces during the uprising. Constance Markievicz was the only woman tried and was kept in solitary confinement. Out of 90 death sentences, 15 were carried out, including all 7 signatories of the proclamation. The executions occurred between May 3rd and May 12th at Kilmainham Gaol. Maxwell mentioned that only the main conspirators and those guilty of outright murder would face execution. Nonetheless, among the executed were individuals who weren't leaders or hadn't killed anyone, like Willie Pearce and John McBride. Thomas Kent was executed not for participating in the rising, but for a police officer's death during a raid on his house afterward. The most notable leader to avoid execution was Eamon de Valera, likely due to his American birth. The arrests and executions sparked a significant public backlash and a rise in anti-English sentiment, with many viewing the harsh measures as an assault on Irish nationalism in general. Following Connolly's execution, the remaining death sentences were commuted amid growing support for republicanism. Notably, being imprisoned did not deter the rebels, who became even more engaged in the cause after their release. In a related note, under the Defence of the Realm Act of 1914, 1,836 men were detained in England and Wales, mostly from urban areas, and not all directly involved in the rising. These internment camps became hotbeds of nationalism, with detainees engaging in activities like Gaelic football, crafting of Gaelic symbols, and lessons in Irish, all fostering a strong sense of unity and purpose. Despite the official end to martial law by November's end, Casement was tried in London for high treason and executed on August 3rd. On the 25th of April, Francis Sheehy Skeffington, who hailed from Dublin and was well known for his pacifist and nationalist views, found himself arrested. That same evening, he was forcibly taken as a human shield by Captain John Bowen Colthurst, who also killed a teenage boy. The tragedy deepened the following day when Sheehy Skeffington, along with 2 journalists, was executed. Just 2 hours after this grim episode, Captain Bowen Colthurst captured Richard O'Carroll, a councillor from the Labour Party and an Irish Republican Brotherhood lieutenant, and had him fatally shot right in the street. Concerned by these actions, Major Sir Francis Vane took it upon himself to report Bowen Colthurst, leading to a court-martial. The verdict was that Bowen Colthurst was guilty but mentally unstable, and he was confined to an asylum. The outrage spurred by these events prompted a deeper investigation, which uncovered the murders and an attempt to conceal them. This had a profound impact, stirring anger among the public. Another horrific incident unfolded between the 28th and 29th of April, known as the North King Street Massacre. Soldiers from the South Staffordshire Regiment, led by Colonel Henry Taylor, violently entered homes on North King Street, accusing 15 male civilians of rebellion and brutally killing them. They shot or bayoneted these individuals, robbing them before secretly burying some in cellars or backyards. This area experienced intense battle, with the British forces suffering significant losses. Maxwell, in an attempt to justify these actions, blamed the rebels, asserting that the troops showed great restraint despite the circumstances. However, an inquiry into these actions found the soldiers had killed unarmed and unoffending residents and did not hold any specific soldiers accountable. Following these events, a royal commission led by Lord Hardinge of Penshurst was established to investigate the rising's causes. Starting on May 18th, the commission heard from several significant figures, including Sir Matthew Nathan and Augustine Birrell, both of whom had resigned in the aftermath of the rising. The commission's report, released on June 26, criticised the Dublin administration's approach to governance, suggesting a preference to avoid enforcing the law to not upset any Irish factions. Following the rising, pressure led to various resignations and reshufflings within the administration, marking a significant moment of accountability and change. Many people in Dublin were initially confused and unprepared when the rising suddenly started. James Stephens, who was in the city at the time, observed that it caught everyone off guard, making it difficult for them to pick a side. Spectators likened the damage in Dublin, notably the over 90 fires on Sackville Street, to the devastation seen in European towns during the war. In the chaos that followed, the Irish government struggled to find its footing. There was a noticeable backlash against the volunteers, especially in areas where many British Army families lived, leading to both verbal and physical confrontations. This negative sentiment was partly due to the economic fallout from the rising, including disrupted trade and unemployment, which sparked looting and left people struggling financially. The total cost was around £2,500,000. Despite this, there was some support for the rebels, evident from the crowds that cheered for the prisoners and the silent respect shown by others. However, due to martial law, many kept their support quiet, though a strong feeling of disloyalty lingered. In response to this support and leveraging the nationalist sentiment, the Catholic Bulletin became a vocal supporter of the volunteers. It praised those who had died and encouraged donations, alongside providing entertainment to further their cause. Its religious nature allowed it to bypass the heavy censorship and restrictions on Republican material, thus reaching a wide audience with its messages. The British government eventually compensated the damages caused by the rising, amounting to £2,500,000. Additionally, international aid and support from nationalists helped the families affected by the event. On April 19, 1917, Count Plunkett sparked the creation of a wide-ranging political group under the name Sinn Féin during a meeting. This movement officially came together at the Sinn Féin Ard Fais on October 25, 1917. The group gained a massive boost in public support due to the conscription crisis of 1918, just before the general elections to the British Parliament on December 14, 1918. In those elections, Sinn Féin won an overwhelming victory, securing 73 out of 105 seats. The elected members of Parliament convened in Dublin on January 21, 1919, to establish Dáil Éireann and put forward the Declaration of Independence. Their popularity skyrocketed due to their connection with the Rising, a relationship that significantly enhanced their political prominence until the end of the century. Many individuals involved in the Rising quickly moved into electoral roles. Sinn Féin emerged as a strong alternative to the Irish Parliamentary Party, which lost favour by supporting British establishments. Furthermore, Sinn Féin developed a close association with the Irish Republican Army, aiming to advance the ideals of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and engaging in armed resistance against British forces. In 1916, Ireland experienced two major events that have left a lasting imprint on its history: the Easter Rising, which is particularly significant to Irish Republicans, and the Battle of the Somme, which holds similar importance for Ulster Unionists. The Easter Rising was a key moment in ending British colonial rule in Ireland, leading to the Irish War of Independence. Its legacy is complex, but the Declaration of the Republic and the subsequent executions of its leaders stand out as pivotal points. For many years, annual parades celebrated the Rising, but they stopped with the onset of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, as they were thought to support Republican paramilitary violence. However, the Rising continues to be a prominent theme in Republican murals in Northern Ireland. Though these commemorations view the Rising as the birth of the Irish state, Unionists argue that it was an illegal act against the British state and should not be celebrated. The revival of these parades has sparked considerable public debate. Nevertheless, the 100th anniversary of the Rising was marked by ceremonies and memorials that were widely regarded as sensitive and successful. The leaders of the Rising were immediately hailed as martyrs, a sentiment that has been absorbed into a broader tradition of Republican martyrdom. This notion was further bolstered as the Catholic Church linked the narrative of the Rising with the founding myth of the Irish Free State, intertwining republicanism with Catholicism. This blend of Catholicism, Gaelicism, and spiritual nationalism, often associated with Patrick Pearse, became a guiding philosophy within republicanism. In the Free State, the Rising was portrayed by officials as a highly disciplined military operation, even though historians generally agree that its symbolic sacrifice had more impact than its actual military achievements. As noted by Monk Gibbon, it was not so much the actions of the rebels during the Easter week, but rather the British response, particularly the executions, that did more to pave the way for the Republic of Ireland. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.